They opened a 3,000-year-old limestone coffin. What they found inside shocked the world. Do you believe there was once a 3,000-year-old coffin containing mysterious amulets and a winged cobra made of pure gold? That an ancient burial site with 41 graves unexpectedly contained coins dating back hundreds of years before the people buried there? That a small room in Pompeii still preserved wooden beds, water jars, and a chamber pot belonging to a family of slaves? Or that a 1,900-year-old lead tablet carried curses written in ancient Greek? Hard to believe, right? But all of these are real archaeological discoveries, and each one is telling us stories that history once forgot. Hello, everyone! Welcome to Ancient History, where we uncover pages of history that have been buried beneath the earth, explore civilizations that existed thousands of years ago, and investigate mysteries that scientists still cannot fully explain to this day. My friends, archaeology has a truly strange and powerful appeal. Every time a layer of soil is carefully removed, no one can know for certain what is waiting underneath. It might be nothing more than a broken piece of pottery, an old coin, or a few fragments of bone. But sometimes, a single small object can be enough to reveal an entire story about the people of the past. To prove exactly what I mean, in today's journey, I will take you through a series of discoveries just like these. From a limestone coffin in Egypt, ancient burial sites in China, and a buried room in Pompeii, to the sword of a Saka warrior, Roman wooden sandals, and the remarkable burial of a dingo that was more than 1,000 years old. Every discovery is a story, every object is a clue, and behind all of them, there are still questions that remain unanswered. So, are you ready to join me on this journey? If you are, then let's begin with the very first discovery right now. 3,000-year-old limestone coffin and a mysterious treasure that stunned Egypt. Do you know that archaeology is always fascinating and mysterious in its own way, especially when it comes to ancient tombs? There are ancient tombs that, when opened, contain nothing more than a few fragments of bone, a broken vessel, or a handful of burial objects that have decayed over time. But there are also places that leave archaeologists standing in stunned silence, because inside them are still the very objects that ancient people once believed could accompany them into the afterlife. And one such discovery emerged at Al-Gharafa in the Minya region near Tuna el-Gebel, Egypt. During excavations there, experts from the Supreme Council of Antiquities of Egypt unexpectedly discovered a special burial site dating back 3,000 years. It was later identified as belonging to Jehuti Imhotep, a high-ranking priest who held a significant position in ancient Egyptian society and worshipped Jehuti, the god associated with wisdom, writing, and knowledge. Of course, what made this discovery remarkable was not simply its age of around 3,000 years, but also the coffin itself. Jehuti Imhotep's coffin was made from limestone, a material commonly used in ancient Egyptian architecture and burial practices. The carvings on the surface of the coffin were still relatively well preserved, and traces of color remained visible even after thousands of years. But if you had only looked at the outside, you probably would never have guessed what was waiting inside. So, the archaeologists quickly began examining the interior of the burial complex. It was here that they discovered numerous ushabti figures, small statues commonly placed inside tombs to symbolically serve the deceased. According to ancient Egyptian beliefs, when the dead entered the afterlife, ushabti figures could perform the necessary tasks on their behalf. Put simply, the ancient Egyptians seem to have prepared for the afterlife with the same level of care as someone packing for a very long journey. But even that was not what surprised the experts most. Even more remarkable was the collection of numerous amulets and scarab figures in a wide variety of shapes and sizes found inside the tomb. Some of the amulets were shaped like hearts, while others depicted the heads of the goddess Hathor, the four sons of Horus, and even winged amulets. You see, in ancient Egyptian culture, amulets were not simply pieces of jewelry. They often carried meanings associated with protection, good fortune, and assistance for the deceased during their journey into the afterlife. Because of this, the presence of such a large collection of different amulets inside the tomb suggests that its owner may have been prepared for the afterlife according to a very special ritual. But there was still more. Among these artifacts was an object that was truly rare, a winged cobra crafted from pure gold. The image of the cobra held a special place in the symbolic world of ancient Egypt, often associated with power, protection, and the divine. When combined with wings and crafted from gold, the artifact would have stood out even more prominently among the entire collection. Mustafa Waziri, Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities and the head of the excavation team, said that the tomb contained an extremely diverse collection of amulets and small statues. And if you try to put yourself in the position of the archaeologists at that moment, the feeling must have been difficult to describe. Thousands of years had passed. The civilization that built enormous pyramids had disappeared long ago. Yet when the stone coffin was opened, the symbols that ancient Egyptians had entrusted with their journey into the afterlife were still there. In many ways, the discovery at Al-Gharafa did more than allow archaeologists to see valuable ancient objects. More importantly, it opened a window into how the ancient Egyptians understood death, the gods, and the life that awaited people after they left this world. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is this. After roughly 3,000 years, the servants, the amulets, and the golden cobra were still there, as if the owner of the tomb had never truly left. Do you think this discovery is significant? One single tomb can tell us so much about the burial practices and beliefs surrounding death in the ancient world. Isn't that exactly the kind of fascinating story we were never taught in our textbooks? 135 mysterious artifacts in 41 ancient Qing dynasty tombs in China reveals something unusual. My friends, if the Egyptian priest's tomb attracted attention because of its mysterious amulets and rare golden artifact, then in a completely different part of the world, Chinese archaeologists were faced with an equally fascinating question. Why were objects dating back hundreds of years apart found inside 41 tombs from the Qing dynasty? The story began in Hebei Province, northern China, where experts from the Hebei Provincial Institute of Cultural Heritage conducted a survey of an ancient burial complex. But as the excavation expanded, they realized that this was not just a small group of individual tombs. Instead, it was a sizable burial site covering an area of approximately 21,500 square feet. In total, 41 tombs were identified. Most of the tombs are believed to date to the early period of the Qing dynasty, a dynasty that began in 1644 and ended in 1911. In terms of time, that means the people buried here lived several centuries ago. At first glance, the discovery did not seem particularly difficult to understand. A Qing dynasty burial site containing Qing dynasty grave goods, everything appeared to make perfect sense. The archaeologists began cataloging the artifacts, and the final number reached 135 objects. Among them were approximately 80 bronze coins, 43 ceramic objects, along with several buttons and rings. Interestingly, many of the ceramic objects were covered with black or brown glaze, giving them a distinctive appearance compared with the colorful ceramics we often associate with ancient China. But what truly caught the research team's attention were the coins. When the experts examined them more carefully, they discovered that 2 of the coins had been minted during the Tang dynasty, a dynasty that existed from approximately AD 618 to 907. That means these coins were created long before the Qing dynasty. And that was not all. Another pair of coins was identified as artifacts originating from the Song dynasty, which lasted from approximately AD 960 to 1279. To make this easier to understand, imagine it this way. A person was buried during the Qing dynasty, yet beside them were coins that had already existed during the Tang and Song dynasties. The gap between them could span hundreds of years. And this is where the question begins. How many hands had those coins passed through before they finally came to rest inside these tombs? That is precisely what makes the burial site in Hebei so fascinating. Of course, this does not necessarily mean that people living during the Qing dynasty directly used coins from the Tang or Song dynasties. In archaeology, an artifact that is several centuries older can easily have been preserved, traded, reused, or passed down from one generation to another before eventually being placed inside a tomb. And that process itself becomes an important clue, because an object found inside a tomb does not only tell the story of the person who died. Sometimes, it can also tell the story of the people who once owned that object before them. Researchers also noticed that this burial complex shared several similarities with the architectural styles of Song dynasty tombs. This is an important detail because it suggests that burial traditions did not always disappear the moment a dynasty came to an end. Instead, certain customs, architectural styles, and tomb layouts could continue to exist, evolve, and be passed down through multiple generations. For this reason, the 41 tombs in Hebei could become an important piece of evidence for archaeologists trying to understand the transformation of burial customs from the Song dynasty to the Qing dynasty. If we only look at the numbers, 41 tombs, 135 artifacts, 80 coins, and 43 ceramic objects, we might think this was simply another ordinary archaeological excavation. But sometimes, that is exactly what makes archaeology so fascinating. An old coin lying inside a newer tomb can force us to look at an entire historical story from a different perspective. A seemingly ordinary ceramic object can help experts trace the development of everyday life and burial practices. And perhaps among these seemingly insignificant artifacts, there may still be an object capable of revealing more about how the people of ancient China understood death, family, and the memory of generations who came before them. 41 tombs were opened, and 135 artifacts were documented. But perhaps the most valuable discovery made by the archaeologists was not hidden inside any box or ceramic vessel. It was the story of how traditions were preserved across hundreds of years of history. What do you think about this discovery? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 172 square foot room in Pompeii reveals the hidden life of an enslaved family. You see, archaeology isn't always about treasure, ancient tombs, gold and precious stones, or mummies. That's right. Some archaeological discoveries leave people stunned because of their gold, priceless statues, or luxurious objects. But other discoveries don't shine at all. In fact, they may look completely ordinary, yet they can allow us to see a glimpse of how people lived nearly 2,000 years ago. One powerful example of this can be found right in Pompeii, southern Italy. We don't need to say too much about Pompeii, because the site is already world famous, and countless archaeological discoveries have been made there. But what if I told you that archaeologists recently made another remarkable discovery there? A room measuring only about 172 square feet. At first, that doesn't sound particularly special, does it? Well, you're right. But take a closer look at what was left inside that room. There were 3 wooden beds, along with a variety of everyday household objects. 2 of the beds were about 5.6 feet long, while the third was only about 4.6 feet long. What do you think all of these objects tell us? Archaeologists believe the room did not resemble a living space intended for a wealthy family. There were no spacious areas, no luxurious furniture, and no signs suggesting that the people who used the room belonged to the upper class. Instead, the room may once have been home to a small enslaved family. Of course, this is only an initial interpretation, but if that interpretation is correct, then we are looking at one of the rare spaces that can provide a direct glimpse into the lives of people who belong to the lowest levels of Pompeii's society. And that's where the significance of this discovery really lies. Roman history is often told through the stories of emperors, generals, politicians, and wealthy families. But the lives of enslaved people who made up a significant portion of Roman society left behind far fewer traces. And then, this tiny room appeared. The 3 wooden beds were still there. Alongside them were ceramic vessels, water containers, and a chamber pot. There was nothing glamorous about them, but those ordinary household objects are exactly what make this discovery so valuable. Because if a golden statue can tell us what the wealthy once owned, a chamber pot or a water container can tell us how an ordinary person actually lived. Even more remarkable is the level of preservation inside the room. After Mount Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, the city was buried beneath layers of volcanic material. The devastating disaster claimed the lives of many people, but in a haunting twist of fate, the rapid burial also helped preserve countless traces of ancient life. Because of this, nearly 2,000 years later, archaeologists can still enter spaces once used by ordinary Romans. And inside this room, they found no bars, locks, or chains. That detail is particularly significant. If the people who lived here really were enslaved, then why was there no obvious system of physical confinement? The directors of the Archaeological Park of Pompeii have suggested that controlling enslaved people did not necessarily depend on iron barriers or locks. Instead, it may have been maintained through the social structure and internal organization of slavery. In other words, a person did not have to be chained to a wall to be completely deprived of freedom. That is one of the harsh realities of ancient Roman society. Under Roman law, enslaved people were considered property and did not possess independent legal status. They could be bought, sold, transferred, and controlled by their owners. So this 172-square-foot room was not simply a bedroom. It was a small window into an entire society. The 3 beds suggest that several people may have lived together in a cramped space. The vessels and everyday objects show that they still had ordinary lives filled with basic daily needs. And the absence of bars or chains reminds us that oppression does not always require something visible to the naked eye. Perhaps that is what makes this discovery so thought-provoking. When Pompeii was buried by the volcano, wealthy people may have lost their villas, possessions, and precious belongings. But somewhere inside small rooms like this one, the lives of enslaved people were also frozen in time. Nearly 2,000 years later, archaeologists opened that door again, not to find gold, but to find ordinary people who once lived, worked, and existed within a society whose history is so often told from the perspective of those at the top. You see, with just one room measuring 172 square feet, Pompeii has shown us something very clearly. Sometimes the greatest secrets of history are hidden in the smallest and most ordinary places. A heartbreaking discovery, but a fascinating one, don't you think? 1,900-year-old Roman lead tablet containing a curse for revenge baffles archaeologists. Hey, imagine that one day you discovered a small piece of metal buried underground. Would you ever think that it could contain a curse written nearly 2,000 years ago? Probably not. But that is exactly what happened in Heerlen, the Netherlands, a peaceful city today that was once an important military outpost of the Roman Empire. During excavations beneath the area of the town hall square, archaeologists discovered an extremely unusual artifact, a small lead tablet engraved with lines of text connected to a curse and a desire for revenge. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an old piece of lead. But when experts began examining the faint markings on its surface, the story behind it became much stranger. Around 2,000 years ago, the Romans believed that people could call upon supernatural forces to resolve conflicts they were unable to handle themselves. If someone had been insulted, was facing romantic competition, involved in a legal dispute, or even competing against someone in a sporting contest, they could turn to a cursing ritual. They would write what they wanted on a sheet of lead or another suitable material, and then direct their plea toward gods or supernatural beings. Such tablets were known as defictiones in Latin and katadesmoi in Greek. And this is exactly what makes the discovery at Heerlen so unusual. While most curse tablets discovered in Northern Europe were written in Latin, the tablet from Heerlen was written in ancient Greek. Think about that for a moment. A Roman military outpost in a region that is now the Netherlands. An artifact created within the Roman world. Yet the language used on it was Greek. That alone is enough to raise a whole series of questions for researchers, isn't it? The tablet measures approximately 4 by 2 inches and was made of lead, a material commonly used for Roman curse tablets discovered across Northern Europe. Over time, the writing on its surface had become faint and difficult to read. However, experts from Heidelberg University carried out a detailed analysis using modern techniques, carefully examining every surviving mark. Their research revealed 3 groups of characters on the tablet. Some of the lines contained appeals to divine powers and supernatural entities. Even more remarkably, the way these appeals were expressed showed influences from Egyptian magical traditions, while the entire text itself was written in ancient Greek. But that was not the end of the mystery. After further analysis, researchers discovered another unusual detail. The lead tablet contained 3 magical symbols, known as characteres. These symbols were not simply ordinary writing. Researchers believe they may have served as a means of communicating the intentions of the person who created the curse to the supernatural beings mentioned in the text. In other words, the person who created the tablet was apparently not simply writing an ordinary prayer. They were attempting to send a message into the supernatural world. Beneath these symbols, the research team also identified the names of 2 men and 2 women. These individuals were described as fellow slaves. But what caught the experts' attention even more were their names. The 2 men had Latin names, while the 2 women had Greek names. This combination raises several possibilities regarding the origins, social status, and relationships of the people mentioned on the tablet. Dr. Julia Lugovaya, who studied the artifact, suggested that it could not be ruled out that one of the two women was actually the person who created the tablet and may have been capable of using writing to perform the cursing ritual. But who exactly did she want to curse? That is the part archaeologists still cannot fully answer. The remaining text on the tablet had become too faint to identify the target of the curse with certainty. However, the research team believes it may have been connected to love, sports, or a legal dispute. And that actually fits quite well with what we know about Roman curse tablets. They were not necessarily created only by superstitious people seeking revenge against an enemy. Instead, they reflect something deeply human. When people feel powerless in the face of a problem, they often search for some way to regain control. Interestingly, Heerlen was not the only place where artifacts like this have been discovered. Archaeologists have found 30 curse tablets inside a well approximately 31.5 feet deep at Kerameikos, an archaeological site in Athens, Greece. Those artifacts date back approximately 2,500 years. Then, in 2022, another 21 similar artifacts were discovered at a Roman cemetery in France, dating from the 1st to the 3rd centuries AD. These discoveries show that curses were not an isolated phenomenon. They were once part of the spiritual lives of many ancient communities. And when we look at the tiny lead tablet discovered at Heerlen, we can see something surprisingly familiar. Nearly 2,000 years ago, people also faced rivalries, complicated relationships, disputes, and individuals who made them angry, just as people do today. There was only one difference. Instead of sending a text, posting online, or immediately turning to the legal system, someone chose to write the name of an opponent onto a piece of lead and send a plea for help to the supernatural world. A tiny object that lay silently underground for nearly 2,000 years, yet preserved a story of anger, hatred, belief, and the desire for revenge belonging to a person whose identity we will probably never know. And that is exactly what makes archaeology so fascinating. Sometimes, all it takes is a piece of lead only a few inches across to open an entire world that disappeared nearly 2,000 years ago. Saka warrior clutched a bronze sword for more than 2,600 years. During a survey and excavation of an ancient burial complex in the area, experts from the Karaganda Regional Museum of Local History discovered a remarkable tomb dating to approximately the 6th or 7th century BC. That means the tomb is roughly 2,600 years old. In Monday, they found the relatively well-preserved remains of an adult man, along with several grave goods placed beside him. And right next to the deceased man's right hand was an object that made the entire discovery even more remarkable. It was a bronze Akinak sword. The sword was approximately 12 inches long, cast as a single piece consisting of both the blade and handle, with a reinforcing ridge running along the length of the blade. Try to picture the scene. A warrior who died more than 2.5 millennia ago. His body gradually disappeared with the passage of time, but beside him remained the sword that had once been associated with his life. And most notably, the sword was positioned near his right hand. Isn't that a position that naturally makes us imagine a warrior holding his weapon? Of course, archaeology cannot rely on a single detail to determine exactly how the man held the sword while he was alive. But the placement of the weapon directly beside his hand is still an important clue about how the ancient people who buried him may have wanted to portray his identity. The man was identified as belonging to the Saka, a nomadic and warrior culture that once lived across large parts of Central Asia during antiquity. Historically, the Saka were known for their horsemanship, archery, and fighting skills. So, finding a Saka warrior buried with a weapon is not particularly surprising. But when archaeologists continued examining the rest of the tomb, they discovered several more fascinating details. Near the man's left foot, they found 5 bronze arrowheads. If the sword evokes an image of close-range combat, the arrowheads suggest that the deceased may also have been familiar with long-range weapons. But that wasn't all. Near the skull, the archaeological team discovered something completely different. It was a finely designed gold earring. The earring was made with an iron base covered by a thin layer of gold. This combination of iron and gold suggests that ancient Saka craftsmen were not only capable of producing weapons, but also possessed impressive metalworking skills. And that is particularly significant. When people think about ancient nomadic communities, they often imagine them only in connection with constant movement, herds of livestock, and warfare. But the artifacts found inside this tomb reveal a much more complex picture. They knew how to smelt and work metal. They knew how to create weapons with specialized structures. They possessed gold jewelry, and most importantly, they had burial rituals that reflected the status and identity of the deceased. The 12-inch long Akinak sword may not have been the largest weapon ever discovered, but within the context of this particular tomb, it seems almost like a final introduction to the warrior. He was not buried alone. He carried weapons with him. There was a sword, arrows, and jewelry. These objects may have been deliberately chosen to represent the person he had been during his lifetime. And this is exactly what makes warrior burials so fascinating. We have no direct account from this man. No diary, no letter, not even an inscription telling us where he fought or what kind of life he lived. But the sword beside his hand, the arrowheads near his foot, and the gold earring beside his skull have become pieces of a puzzle that archaeologists can use to reconstruct his story. More than 2,600 years have passed. Empires, kingdoms, and communities that once existed across this land have changed. The people who once knew who this Saka warrior was disappeared long ago. Yet when archaeologists carefully removed each artifact from the ground, it was almost as if the warrior was being named once again. Not by his real name, but by the objects he carried with him into the afterlife. A bronze sword beside his right hand, 5 arrowheads near his foot, a gold earring beside his skull. 3 simple details. Yet after more than 2,600 years, they are still enough to tell the story of a Saka warrior who once lived, fought, and was ultimately buried with objects that reflected his identity. And perhaps that is the greatest wonder of archaeology. When people disappear, sometimes the objects they leave behind become the storytellers who speak for them. Do you think so? Or do you have another interesting interpretation of this discovery? If you do, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments so we can discuss it together. Thousands of Roman sandals beneath the mud reveal secrets of a 2,000-year-old bathhouse. If there were one type of object you thought could never survive intact for nearly 2,000 years, what would it be? Perhaps most people would think of wood, right? Wood rots easily. Leather decomposes. The things we use every day tend to disappear relatively quickly when buried underground. Yet at Vindolanda, an ancient Roman fort in Northumberland, England, archaeologists discovered a collection that has surprised many people. Thousands of Roman sandals, including dozens of wooden clogs preserved in astonishing condition. And what makes them even more fascinating is that they may tell us how the ancient Romans used bathhouses. You see, Vindolanda was once a fort located along Hadrian's Wall, the famous defensive system built in the northern part of Roman Britannia. But it wasn't simply a place where soldiers were stationed. It was also a community with all kinds of everyday activities. Within a special layer of mud at the site, archaeologists discovered more than 5,000 Roman sandals. That number sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? But what caught the experts' attention even more was the discovery of around 50 wooden clogs among those 5,000 sandals. They are believed to have been the type of footwear used in Roman public bathhouses. Their construction was fairly simple. The soles were made of wood, while leather straps were attached to the top to hold the feet in place. Some pairs had relatively thick soles measuring around 1 to 2 inches. So why did the Romans need clogs with such thick soles? The answer was right beneath their feet. Roman bathhouses were not simply places where people went to bathe. They were an important part of community life. People could come there to relax, meet friends, have conversations, and spend time participating in social activities. But inside these buildings, there was a very practical problem. The floors could be extremely hot and slippery. The ancient Romans developed a famous underfloor heating system known as the hypocaust. Basically, they built furnaces beneath a raised floor, allowing hot air to circulate underneath and warm the rooms above. This technology was remarkably sophisticated for the ancient world. But it also had a drawback. The floors could become so hot that walking barefoot on them was uncomfortable. And that was where the wooden clogs came in. They created a layer of insulation between the feet and the hot floor, while also helping people move more safely across wet and slippery surfaces. If you've ever stepped out of a shower with wet feet and nearly slipped, you can probably understand immediately why the Romans needed them. The Roman bathing process itself was also quite interesting. Typically, bathers would remove their clothes and move through areas with different temperatures. They might begin in a cold room, then move into a warm room, continue into a hot room, and eventually return to the initial area to cool themselves in cold water. So Roman bathhouses were not only places for personal hygiene, they were also spaces for socializing and relaxation, and these small wooden clogs were part of that experience. But why have they survived all the way to the present day? That's probably the question everyone would ask. After all, we know that organic materials such as wood and leather normally decompose relatively quickly, so what made these objects different? Experts say that at Vindolanda, many artifacts were buried in layers of oxygen-poor mud, which significantly slowed the decomposition process. And because of these unusual conditions, archaeologists had the opportunity to study everyday objects that would normally have been almost impossible to preserve for such a long period underground. Some of the clogs have completely smooth surfaces, but others were decorated with geometric patterns, and some even had carvings that appear to imitate toes on the surface. Just by looking at these details, we can imagine that these were not objects made carelessly or without thought. However, there is one important point that needs to be made clear. Researchers still cannot definitively confirm that the clogs at Vindolanda are the oldest bathhouse clogs in the world. Archaeologists have previously discovered much older types of footwear. For example, the collection of sandals belonging to Pharaoh Tutankhamun in Egypt dates back approximately 3,300 years to around 1300 BC. The Etruscans also used sandals with metal frames as early as around the 6th century BC, and in 2025, 2 wooden clogs for children were discovered at Isarnodurum, France, a Roman period archaeological site. These artifacts are slightly older than the clogs found at Vindolanda. If further research confirms that they were used specifically in bathhouses, they could become the oldest known wooden bathhouse clogs ever discovered. But regardless of what the final conclusion turns out to be, the discovery at Vindolanda remains incredibly fascinating, because it reveals a very ordinary side of Roman life that monumental buildings and military victories could never tell us about. We often remember Rome through its powerful armies, enormous arenas, and stone roads stretching for thousands of miles. But a civilization is also built from small things like these: a pair of clogs, a leather strap, a hot floor, a person stepping out of a bathhouse and needing to protect their feet. Nearly 2,000 years later, those clogs still lay beneath the mud at Vindolanda, reminding us that no matter how different the ancient world may seem from our own, people back then still had to deal with remarkably familiar problems. And sometimes, to understand how a great civilization actually lived, you don't need to look at its thrones or battlefields. You only need to look down at its feet. 1,800-year-old Roman villa beneath a school gym. You know, some archaeological discoveries begin with carefully planned excavations, complete with heavy machinery, experts, and research plans that may take years to complete. But other discoveries begin with something much simpler. Let's go to Cavour Scientific High School in Rome, Italy. It was here that a group of students accidentally discovered ancient remains beneath the school's gymnasium. At first, probably no one imagined that an entire section of the ancient Roman Empire could still exist beneath a modern building. But after the students reported what they had found to their teachers, the authorities and archaeologists were notified and quickly arrived at the site to investigate. What they discovered was astonishing. Beneath the modern school, an entirely different world was slowly emerging. Experts uncovered dark corridors and dimly lit rooms, which were identified as part of a luxurious Roman villa dating back to around the 2nd century AD. In other words, the place where students exercise today was once part of a building constructed approximately 1,800 years ago. This was not an ordinary house. The remains indicate that it was once a domus, a large residence typically belonging to people of higher social status in Roman society, and its location makes the story even more fascinating. Liceo Scientifico Cavour is located very close to the Colosseum, one of the most famous landmarks in Rome. Archaeologists have been interested in this area for a very long time. Excavations carried out as early as the late 19th century had already uncovered parts of ancient Roman structures. But there is one major problem. Modern Rome was built directly on top of ancient Rome. Century after century, the city continued to expand. New buildings were constructed over old foundations. Streets covered layers of ancient architecture. Schools and modern buildings concealed what remained beneath them. As a result, many of the ancient city's secrets are still lying directly beneath the feet of modern people, and the Domus Liceo Cavour is an extraordinary example of this. According to experts, the villa was built around the middle of the 2nd century AD. This conclusion is based in part on an inscription that was discovered during excavations in the late 19th century. Researchers believe the house may once have belonged to a member of the Umbrius family. We don't currently know very much about this family. However, experts believe they may have originated from Samnium, a region located in what is now central and southern Italy, not too far from Pompeii, the city that was buried during the volcanic disaster of AD 79. But what excited archaeologists most were the walls. During the excavation, they discovered frescoes depicting people and floral motifs. These images once decorated the rooms of the villa, suggesting that its owners had enough wealth and status to invest in elaborate interior decoration. Along the ceiling arches, experts also discovered decorative plasterwork, and then another room revealed an even bigger surprise. Inside was a large mosaic. The patterns on the mosaic featured irregular shapes, a style that was once fairly popular among the Roman upper classes during this period. Try to imagine it. Around 1,800 years ago, a wealthy family of status walked through this room. Light fell across the paintings on the walls. Beneath their feet were tiny mosaic pieces arranged into intricate patterns. Above them were decorative plaster designs along the ceiling. Then time passed. The building was abandoned. New generations appeared. Rome continued to grow. Eventually, a modern school was built above it, and nearly 2,000 years later, a group of students accidentally opened a doorway leading back into the past. But the story contains another fascinating detail. During their research, archaeologists also discovered graffiti created in the 20th century by students, tourists, and other people who had explored this underground area. This created an incredibly interesting contrast. On one side were paintings and decorative patterns created by the Romans approximately 1,800 years ago. On the other were graffiti marks left by people living in the modern era. Two layers of traces from two completely different periods, yet both preserved in the same place. It is almost as if Rome had preserved both stories within a single space. However, archaeologists have only excavated part of the Domus Liceo Cavour. The reason is simple, yet extremely challenging. The villa lies deep beneath a school that is still in operation. They cannot simply tear up the entire foundation of the school to search for the rest of the villa. Because of this, the research must proceed step by step. The school and the archaeological authorities are expected to continue working together to preserve the site. One idea that has been proposed is to potentially open the area to visitors in the future, while also giving students the opportunity to become guides themselves. If that plan becomes a reality, it would create a truly remarkable scene. A student could walk down beneath the gymnasium of the very school they attend and stand in front of a mosaic created nearly 1,800 years ago. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this discovery so memorable. The Roman villa was not hidden in some remote wilderness far from the city. It was lying directly beneath a modern school, right in the heart of Rome, where the past and present almost seem to overlap. Sometimes you don't have to travel far to find history. History might be lying right beneath the floor you walk across every day. Pretty fascinating, isn't it? The grave of a dingo, more than 1,000 years ago, revealing a secret that surprised archaeologists. The story began in 2000. When a road construction project passed through the area, the edge of an ancient burial site was disturbed. An indigenous resident named Uncle Badger Bates, together with park ranger Dan Witter, discovered evidence of the grave. When they examined the inside, they saw fragments of bone. But something was unusual. They were not human bones. The evidence indicated that they belonged to a dingo, a wild animal with an appearance somewhat similar to a domestic dog and a long history in Australia. For many years afterward, the grave remained underground. Then, in 2021, a flood caused the animal's skull to disappear. In 2023, experts returned to excavate the site, and this time they recovered the rest of the complete skeleton. And what they discovered afterward was truly remarkable. Archaeologists determined that this was a male dingo that had been buried by the Barkindji approximately 963 to 916 years ago. The animal died at around 4 to 7 years of age. For a dingo living in the wild, that is considered a relatively advanced age. But what particularly caught the experts' attention were the evidence preserved in its remains. The animal's teeth were significantly worn, suggesting that it had lived for a relatively long time and had access to an adequate food supply. But that wasn't all. The bones also showed that the dingo had suffered serious injuries. Experts discovered evidence of healed fractures, including previously broken ribs and leg bones. This raises a fascinating possibility. The animal survived those injuries, and perhaps it received care from humans. Think about that for a moment. A wild dingo was injured, suffered broken bones, but survived. It then continued living, eating well, growing older, and eventually being carefully buried by people. If this had simply been an animal that happened to die in the wild, the story probably would not be so extraordinary. But the evidence preserved in the skeleton suggests that its relationship with humans may have been much deeper than that. Lucas Koungoulos, the lead author of the study from the University of Western Australia, suggested that this dingo was relatively old and appeared to have been well cared for by humans. The healed injuries, worn teeth, and careful burial form a remarkable chain of evidence. Together, they suggest that the animal may have lived close to humans for an extended period of time, and when it died, people deliberately buried it rather than simply leaving its remains in the wild. This also helps researchers better understand the role of dingoes within the Barkindji community. Dingoes may not have simply been animals living around campsites, warning people of danger or helping protect the community. Evidence suggests that they may have lived alongside humans, received care, and become part of everyday life. But the story doesn't end there. There is another detail that makes this burial even more touching. For more than 500 years after the dingo was buried, generations of Barkindji people continued returning to the grave and leaving small offerings there. These offerings consisted mainly of river mussel shells. According to the researchers' interpretation, they may have been connected to a ritual resembling feeding the deceased animal. Try to imagine the scene. A dingo is buried in the ground. Time passes. One generation follows another. The people who know about the grave continue passing down its story and leaving small objects there. Not just once, but for hundreds of years, Barkindji elders believe that this ritual may reflect the practice of honoring the dingo in a way similar to an ancestor. If that interpretation is correct, the grave was not simply a place where an animal was buried, it became a site of cultural and spiritual significance for the community. Most importantly, the Barkindji people never forgot the location. They continued to preserve the traditions associated with the grave and supported archaeologists during the study of the skeleton. Archaeologist Amy Way, the project leader and a researcher at the Australian Museum, as well as a lecturer at the University of Sydney, believes the discovery is significant because it provides a clearer understanding of the relationship between the Barkindji people and dingoes. You see, archaeology is truly fascinating, isn't it? Some discoveries have been explained, while others remain mysteries, even after scientists have spent countless hours trying to find a reasonable explanation. Which of the discoveries we explored today impressed you the most? Don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the fascinating discoveries featured on ancient history. For now, thank you for watching and goodbye. I'll see you in the next video.